Hey guys, my name's James and welcome to a series of videos based around the use of magic. There'll be fairly simple stuff at first, just showing you each spell, some strengths and weaknesses, followed by some situations where you could use the spell, and there'll be 4 videos, one for each type of magic, followed by a 5th video showcasing the combos for a pure mage. Hopefully you find this useful and enjoy the video. Okay, so this video is going to be based on sorcery. If you're wondering about the stats, my character has 75 attunement, so I'll be using more copies than your average build. It has 60 intelligence, so you'll see it doing a fair bit of damage, and it's using a magic infused Staff of Wisdom, which is the best one for sorcery. So we're going to start with Soul Arrow. This has 4 variants, which is Soul Arrow, Great Soul Arrow, Heavy Soul Arrow and Great Heavy Soul Arrow. They're all pretty much the same thing, they're just magic damage in one direction, fairly fast projectile but it doesn't track. So it means it's good for PvE because it's got loads of uses, so you can take down the mobs with it. It's good against bosses because they won't dodge. I wouldn't say it's great for PvP unless there's like a few of you ganging up on Invader with this kind of spell, because it doesn't track, doesn't do a whole lot of damage. As you can see here, the guy's just dodging it no problem. So you're probably better off with something like Homing Soul Arrow or Soul Spear for PvP. Speaking of Homing Soul Arrow, this thing is epic in my opinion. Probably one of the most useful, if not the most useful PvP spell out there. It's not so good for PvE because you'll notice it's got a real slow moving projectile, it's got a high intelligence requirement, 35 for the heavy version, and it's got less uses in comparison to other more suitable PvE spells. But against other players online, you'll see that this guy, you can't dodge it by just strafing left and right, so you need to roll it. But the problem with that is it's got much different timing to Soul Arrow and Soul Spear, so people tend to get caught off guard with this quite a lot, and it's also great for starting off combos, which I'll show you in a later video. Another good thing about this spell is you don't actually have to be locked on to hit somebody. You can just fire it in their general direction, or as you can see here, I'm just firing it off left and right, and the spell is curling around either side, and it's not too accurate in that way, but it's also something to keep the opponent busy while you do other things, like run at them for an attack on melee, or cast another spell, which is really useful. Next up we have Homing Soul Mass, and in this clip I'm using the Crystal variant. Now this spell is pretty powerful. The more intelligence you've got, the more orbs that spawn, to a max of 5, and I would say it's good for both PvP and PvE, because if you're fighting a particularly tough enemy in single player, you can kind of cast this before you approach them, and then it sets you up to do another spell at the same time or another melee. It's just kind of more preparation, but I would say that mostly it's really handy against other players online. As you can see here, it doesn't actually go off until you're within a certain range, so you can just run at them, with nothing else active, but the usefulness of this spell really comes from when you combo it with other things. So you can cast this and have it ready, and then run at them for a running melee attack or another spell, or you can cast it and face backwards, and it kind of puts pressure on them because then you can control when it goes off, and that can just open a whole world of possibilities that, again, I'll explore more in the combos video to come. Okay, moving on to Soul Spear. Now this is really useful in both single player and the online multiplayer. It's basically massive damage in one direction. I think it's the fastest moving projectile in the game, and it tracks. So you can see here that the guy can't just sidestep it, you actually do need to roll through this one. Now it is a pretty easy roll when you get used to the timing, and if someone's casting it over and over again, it's very easy to dodge. So you need to cast it unpredictably to catch someone in PvP. Now it does go through targets, so if you hit a bunch of hollows in PvE, it will go through them all, which is really handy. And since one of the more recent patches, it does go through shields in PvP. So if someone's got a really resistant magic shield, and you cast them and hit them with this spell, it will go through and deal damage. The only downside to this one is the amount of casts you get per copy. Each one only has 2, so you need to use it sparingly in PvE especially, unless you've got loads of herbs. But it does make it good for duels in PvP where you don't need tons of copies of the same spell. It does cost 40 intelligence for the normal version and 53 for the Crystal Magic version, so you do need to be a pretty focused mage to be able to use this one. Next up we have Shockwave, which in my opinion is one of the least useful spells in the game. As you can see, it shoots really slowly and it doesn't track whatsoever, but when it hits someone it knocks them straight down. Doesn't matter how much poise they've got. And if they're blocking, it does a fair bit of stamina damage, and you might even be able to guard break someone, but the chances of you being able to follow up with an attack are pretty slim. The only real use I could think of using this one is if you're trying to troll somebody. So if you're trying to lure somebody towards a ledge with items, but even then they'll be able to hear the cast and it won't really be as good as a great bow. Maybe you could use it in New Game Plus 7 on some mobs, in PvE, and you could knock them over instead of fighting them to run past, but for the most part there's going to be better options for pretty much anything you want to do other than this spell. This spell is called Soul Spear Barrage, and this shoots off a load of small soul arrows into one direction that have all got fairly low damage, none of them track, and it's also fairly slow moving compared to Soul Spear. Now you'll probably never see this around in PvP because it's not efficient whatsoever. Even in PvE it's better to use a soul arrow because it's longer range, you probably get more uses for your stat requirements, and also you get more damage because you'll have a smaller chance of these missing. Now in PvP, because you only get a few uses of this spell, if you've got the intelligence you might as well just use the regular Soul Spear. The only way I could think of using this is for style points, so if you're going to do a guard break into one of these, that's a pretty safe way to hit it. The only thing you've got to watch out for is if you're not using it like this, you do get locked in one direction, so it's very easy to be punished for this spell. Next up we have Soul Shower, which shoots a ball of souls into the sky and then rains down small arrows towards the target. Now this one depends if you're locked on to the person. If you're not locked on, none of the souls will home in whatsoever, and I would say that it's pretty much useless in PvE because there's never really going to be a time you'll need to use this. Maybe on a boss that's fairly large so that most of the soul arrows hit, but for the most part you'd be better off using other things. In PvP however, this isn't too bad because you can cast it and it gives the opponent some kind of distraction, something to think about while you follow up with something else, but by itself it's not great, it's best used with combos. Next up we have Soul Greatsword, which is a really useful all-round spell in my opinion. It's the best kind of area of effect sorcery spell that we've got. At base level it's 27 intelligence, 3 uses for 1 slot, so it's pretty viable. And in PvE you can just use this to slash through mobs or hollows and any kind of area where there's a few targets all in one place. It's not too bad for bosses, but the damage was nerfed in the patch, so it's not great for taking out one target. In PvP it's really good because, again, it's an area of effect which people don't really expect with sorcery. It's got a longer cast time than Soul Spear and Soul Arrow, which you can use to your advantage because if people are used to rolling those spells, they'll tend to roll too early and get caught out by this. The only downside I would say that, again, it's the cast time on the animation. If people know how to roll this spell, it can leave you wide open for a punish, as you can see here. Moving on to Soul Vortex. Now I have to be honest, before making this video I had this down as the useless spell in Dark Souls 2. It just seemed to do no damage, barely ever hit, despite its cool animation. Now you can see I've done tons of damage on this guy, and I've stunned him for quite a while because I've hit him with the centre of the spell. This could lead up to other spells, you have an opening to cast more spells or more melee attacks for a combo, which is never a bad thing. The only problem is, it's slow moving, the cast animation takes ages despite your cast speed, and it's just a lot of stat requirements for what it does. It's 37 intelligence, which is almost the same as Soul Spear, and you only get 4 uses out of it, so that's something to bear in mind before you use this one. Next up we have Soul Bolt, which is similar to White Dragon Breath from Dark Souls 1 if you remember back to that. It fires a laser beam across the ground, making it a semi-area of effect spell sorcery. Now the good part about this spell is it's massive damage, and I would say that the bad points about it are that it's so punishable. It locks you in one direction for a long time, and I'd say it's the single most punishing action you can do in Dark Souls 2. Now the best places to use this spell I would say is against a boss that's not going to dodge or that's big enough to take the whole beam, which means you'll do a lot of damage, or you can use it on a line of hollows or a particularly slow enemy in PvE, and also in PvP I'd say your best bet to hit someone with it is right after a guard break. If you've got enough cast speed you can cast it straight afterwards, and depending on your melee stats you might do more damage than a melee weapon riposte. It's also worth mentioning that this is one of the 3 spells of sorcery that gives you this blue aura when cast, and I'll explain in a moment why that's relevant. The next sorcery to look at is Soul Geyser, which shoots 4 Soul Spear type projectiles out in one direction, all fairly slow moving and none of them track. You have to treat this one much in the same way as Soul Bolt. It's massive damage in one direction, but it doesn't track too well, and it's not really going to hit a moving target in PvP. Now this is absolutely the boss killer of Dark Souls 2. It does so much damage and it's really easy to hit. It's not great for the general mobs of PvE because it's only got one use for one slot and it's 64 intelligence, so unless you've got so many herbs, it's not really worth casting on every hollow that you meet. In PvP, it's again the same as Soul Bolt, does massive damage if you do manage to land it, but the best ways to land it is to hit a parry or a guard break first. Now with a guard break you're fairly safe in casting it straight afterwards, but due to the hitboxes of this spell, if you do parry somebody, it's better to backstab a couple of times to make sure you do hit them with it. Next up are the 3 weapon buffs for sorcery. It's Magic Weapon, Great Magic Weapon and Crystal Magic Weapon. Each one does more damage than the last and has less uses, along with more of an intelligence requirement. There's not really a lot to say here apart from that it obviously makes your right hand or left hand weapon do more damage and gives it a magic attack. The only thing to watch out for is if you cast this and swap your weapon out, it'll cancel the buff. So people that use a buff tend to keep the weapon out the whole time, making them slightly more predictable than somebody who's constantly changing their equipment over. The next buff we're going to look at is Strong Magic Shield. Now this isn't used nearly enough in my opinion. I don't actually think I've ever ran into anybody using this in PvP. It's only one slot and 18 intelligence, it's very viable and very easy to get. What it basically does is give you 100% resistance on whatever shield you cast it on to all elements and physical damage, meaning that you can use a small shield like this to block out absolutely anything with no damage. There are other shields optional for this, like your average 100% block shield for physical, and a magic infused magic shield for sorceries, and a dark infused transgressor shield for hexes, but this one does all of them in one go. Granted it's only a temporary amount of time, but it's still very useful. One thing to note though is it doesn't reduce stamina damage, so you will take more stamina damage on a small shield than you would a great shield like normal. Next up we have Yearn, which is the same as Oil Decoy back from Dark Souls 1, and this spell shoots a ball of light that sticks to a surface for around 10 seconds, drawing in enemy attention. It doesn't work on every enemy, but for areas like this where there's a bunch of hollows that can be fairly difficult to manage in high new game mode, it's pretty useful to get them all in one place, so you can either take them out with melee or even better throw an area of effect spell in there. Now you can actually damage enemies under the influence of this spell and they won't change their aggression towards you, and you can also cast more than one instance of this spell to overlap the durations of it. The spell has the same effects as a throw and alluring skull. The main difference is this one is cast in a straight line, so you can either target somebody or use it with binoculars to get a bit more accuracy than you would be able to when you throw an alluring skull. I would say this is mostly PvE just to get you past some tough areas, but in PvP you could get a bit creative with the Seed of the Tree Giants and using this spell to direct hollows towards an invader. Moving on to Hush. Now by description this spell says that it silences your movement, which it does. You'll be able to notice that your footsteps no longer make noise when you've got this active, but unfortunately that's about all it does. As you can see from these clips, that even with it active it doesn't reduce the range of hollows, it doesn't stop the ones that are asleep waking up. If you creep up behind them they have the same aggro range, it doesn't stop pressure plates on the ground from going off, and it doesn't silence spell castings or anything like that that would be useful in PvP. So unless I'm missing something really obvious, I just can't find use for this one, but if I have completely missed it then please comment and let me know, I'd much appreciate it. Next up we have Full Control, which is a really useful spell in single player. It basically removes all damage that would be dealt by a fall, as long as the fall wouldn't otherwise kill you. Now it's worth noting that falls in Dark Souls 2 aren't percentage based like there was on Dark Souls 1, they are just damage based. So you'll find that especially with this jumping Majula, you won't be able to survive the fall for a long time. So you'll either need the Cat Ring, which reduces fall damage, or you'll need Full Control, which completely removes it. I would say the only reason this would be useful in PvP is if you're PvP in an area where there are ledges such as this, and you've got it active and you need to make a quick escape or run away, then it could be useful then, but mostly it's the kind of spell you would use in a single player just to give you a helping hand. Here we have another weapon buff, and this one's pretty interesting. It's called Hidden Weapon, and it doesn't just add extra damage onto your weapon like most of the other ones do. This one makes your weapon completely invisible, which is always a good thing in PvP because against advanced players, being unpredictable is absolutely everything. The only problem with this one is, as opposed to an illusory ring, is that it's a buff, so whilst you can be unpredictable with your weapon and moveset for a while, people will eventually tell what kind of weapon you're using. Maybe not the exact one, they just might sort of twig on that you're using a katana or something, and they might learn to counter it. Whereas in an illusory ring you can have a set of 3 in each hand and swap between them all without anyone realising what weapon you've got because it's not a buff and doesn't run out. So that's something to bear in mind if you're going to use this spell. Next up we have Repair, which does exactly what it says. It repairs all of your weapons, armour and rings that you've got equipped at the moment. It doesn't repair them if they're broken. Just like Repair Powder, you'll need to go get it mended at a blacksmith. The difference between Repair Spell and Repair Powder is that I would say the powder is quicker to use and obviously doesn't take an attunement slot, but the Repair Spell is slightly stronger, so will completely repair a weapon, which can sometimes be pretty useful in duels, especially if you're using a weapon that's got a power attack that degrades the weapon. Next up we have Cast Light, which is another obvious one. It just makes a ball of light above your head which lights up dark areas. Now it's pretty similar to Torch, except it lights up the area blue instead of orange, and when you light a torch, if you've already got Cast Light active, the torch will take priority and light the area of orange. As far as I know, the range of the light is the same on both of them, but the advantage to Cast Light, even though it takes an attunement slot, is that you don't need torch time to use it, and you can also use both of your hands, which is pretty useful in areas like the gutter where you might want to block. Next up we have Chameleon, which has always been one of my favourite spells from the Soul series game. This one changes into a piece of scenery based on the area that you're currently in. Now you'll usually get a choice of between 3 or 4 items per area, and for the most part they're all pretty useful, like a barrel or a box or a vase. Occasionally you'll get something that's not useful, like the giant mushroom in Shrine of Romana, or the giant mirror in the castle area, that probably won't hide you from anyone. But I'd say the main use for this one is from hiding from invaders, or hiding from hosts, and jumping out and playing tricks, and it can lead to a lot of fun. There's a lot of possibilities with this spell. It's also worth noting that you can't actually be locked onto while you're in this spell. So if you see here, the guy's got Home and Soul Mat active, and it's not triggering when I go near him because I don't count as a legit target for any spells that would home or track. The same goes for Home and Soul Arrow and Soul Spear and anything that would track you normally. In addition to this, it's different from the last game because you can sprint whilst in Chameleon, so you're a lot more mobile, and also you can block this time, which can be pretty annoying if you've got someone with a decent Great Shield blocking whilst in Chameleon if you can't manage to guard break them. So it's got a lot of uses, pretty versatile spell, and I'd say if you can manage to cast it mid-duel with a mage, it can be pretty competitive as well because it will stop them locking on with certain spells and just give you the upper hand for the next attack. And finally for sorcery we've got Unleash Magic, which is a self buff that increases the damage of all spells you cast. Now this is pretty unique to sorcery because it costs 3 slots instead of 1 to use, and it's also 58 intelligence, and it also gives you a health loss when you use it. So all these together make it a pretty bad drawback for using this spell. Now you have to decide whether it's worth it. I'd say for PvE, certain situations it's definitely worth it, especially if you're co-op in the area and you've got a melee companion that's sort of in front of you, guarding you and whatnot. You can stand back and safely cast these without worrying about the health loss. In PvP however, you've got to think about a few more things. It's not bad for a glass cannon that's kind of focusing on 1 or 2 magic combos, or 1 or 2 spells over and over again, but like I was saying, you need to be predictable in PvP, that's what wins you fights, and I would say that every slot is precious and you're better off mixing it up than just kind of using 3 slots all just for 1 buff that ultimately could get you killed because of the health loss. So it's down to preference really. Okay guys, that's it for sorcery. I know it's all fairly basic stuff, but I hope it's been helpful to at least some of you. Stay tuned for some more magic guides on the other types. I'll be doing one on miracles, hexes and pyromancies very soon, and then I'll be doing a final video based on advanced magic techniques with combos for a pure mage. Again, thanks very much for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.